in the far reaches of northern Florida, where the land buckled into blackwater swamps and the air clung to the skin like a living thing. The settlement of Sacred Rock stood in a quiet that felt unnatural even to those born there. The mission sat at the swamp's edge, its whitewashed walls dulled to a sickly cream by years of humidity and neglect, the bell tower leaning slightly as though straining to hear something in the stillness. Newcomers often remarked that the place seemed too quiet, that the ordinary noises of life, bird calls, wind in the trees, even the faint stir of insects, were swallowed whole before they could travel more than a few yards. It was as if the swamp itself drew every sound into its depths, sealing it away beneath its black, glassy water. Those who had lived there long enough stopped noticing. But for outsiders, the silence was oppressive, a constant reminder that something in this place worked against the natural order. In the summer of 1890, a visiting bishop, Laurent Marceau, came to Sacred Rock on routine inspection, expecting to find the usual concerns of a remote mission. Poorly kept records, dwindling supplies, and the weary patience of priests cut off from the comforts of the city. Instead, he noticed a pattern that unsettled him more than he could name. At sunset, the bells would toll for Vespers, their tone thick and slow as if forced through the heavy air. The congregation would gather, the prayers would be chanted in measured, somber voices. And when the final Amen passed the lips of the priests, a change fell over the mission like a hand closing a door. No one spoke after that, not in whispers, not in passing. Even the children who had played in the dusty courtyard during the day grew still, their games abandoned, their eyes lowered. At first, Marceau assumed this was some obscure regional observance, a local piety meant to honor the sacredness of night. But the longer he stayed, the more he saw that this was no tradition. It was vigilance. The silence was not a choice. It was a guardrail against something no one dared name. He tried to break it one evening, offering a friendly word to one of the brothers as they extinguished the lamps. But the man's hand twitched so sharply it knocked the taper from its holder, his face blanching as though the bishop's voice had carried more than sound. The next morning, Marceau asked about it in casual tones, but the priests deflected with practiced ease, turning the talk to repairs, donations, and the health of the faithful. Yet their eyes told him the truth, eyes that darted to the swamp as though its waters might rise to the windows, eyes that tightened when the sun sank lower and the bell ropes began to stir. One evening, unable to quiet the unease in his chest, he lingered after the prayers, watching from the back of the chapel as the priests moved with mechanical precision, clearing the altar and securing the doors. Their mouths pressed closed as if stitched from the inside, and in that last breath of dusk, the air itself seemed to shift, growing heavier, pressing against the skin in a way that made the bishop's pulse slow. Beyond the walls, the swamp stretched like an endless black mirror, and he thought, though later he would not be sure, that he saw ripples moving toward the mission, though no wind touched the reeds. It was in that moment he understood the silence for what it was. Not an act of reverence, but a form of protection. A ritual barrier against whatever it was that waited in the darkness outside. The question, unspoken but pressing, was protection from what, and why the priest believed that a single word after nightfall could invite it in. Marceau returned to his quarters that night with the heavy taste of the swamp still in his mouth, the damp air clinging to him as if it had learned his shape. When he tried to pray, the words seemed to falter in his mind, curling in on themselves before they could reach his lips, as though even God did not wish to hear them here. The silence stretched on, thick and constant, until at last he fell into an uneasy sleep, the image of still water lingering behind his closed eyes. By morning he would begin searching for answers, unaware that the first clue would not come from the living at all, but from the warped pages of a ledger found in a locked drawer in the rectory. Father Thomas Mallory's ledger was discovered not by accident but by a quiet act of defiance. Bishop Marceau had risen before dawn, hoping to walk the grounds before the priests emerged from their silence to feel the place in its most unguarded state. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth, the mist curling low against the chapel walls. Passing through the rectory, he noticed a desk with a swollen drawer, its lock rusted but still functional. The key absurdly hung on a nail only a few feet away. It was as if no one expected or dared to open it. Inside lay a stack of brittle papers bound in frayed leather, the front cover marked with a cross so faint it seemed worn away by handling. The first pages read like the diary of a dutiful priest, names of births, marriages, and deaths, each written with neat precision. But as the years rolled forward, the tone shifted. By 1868, the entries were no longer gentle records of a parish's life. Instead, they became lists, dates paired with measurements, notes on complexion, weight, and the condition of teeth. There were numbers that made no sense to Marceau, ratios of height to arm span, calculations involving moon phases and the number of days since a baptism. Some names appeared more than once, their later entries marked with a single word: complete. As the bishop read, his stomach turned. Mallory's handwriting grew tighter, the ink pressed into the paper with obsessive force until the script seemed almost carved. Certain entries contained phrases that sounded more like the work of a surveyor or a naturalist than a priest. Structural integrity preserved after exsanguination. Soul latency observed at 90 hours. Residual warmth retained for 42 minutes. It was the cold language of experimentation, but the subjects were the faithful themselves. Margins were filled with strange diagrams, some resembling the outline of a human skeleton, others geometric grids marked with initials at each intersection. There was a rhythm to it, a sense of refinement over time, as though Mallory was perfecting a process with each passing year. Marceau noticed that the ledger's final section, its last 10 pages, was water-damaged, the ink smeared but not gone. The names here matched those on old church registers for burials that had never taken place. A young woman, 19, last seen at evening prayers, a boy of 12 marked as gifted in a margin, an old man, a widower, described only as structurally sound. The word complete followed each, penned with unsettling finality. Between the lines were faint smudges of what looked like ash pressed into the page, the powder clinging to the fibers as though it had been written into the book with care. The ledger was not a confession. It was a record, a ledger in the truest sense, of a methodical harvesting of human life. Marceau could not tell whether Mallory had been alone in this work or whether the mission itself had been built to serve it. But the consistency of the entries, spanning decades without interruption, suggested something larger than a single man's madness. It suggested a tradition. Closing the book, the bishop felt the swamp silence pressing against the windows, and for the first time, he wondered if the thing that swallowed sound was not outside at all, but inside, layered into the walls, the floors, even the prayers. By the time the priests emerged for the day's mass, he had hidden the ledger beneath his coat. He told himself it was only to keep it safe, but part of him knew the truth. He feared what they might do if they found him with it. He did not yet understand that the ledger was only the doorway, and that the true design lay beneath the very ground he walked on. Bishop Marceau's first glimpse of what lay beneath the chapel came not through discovery but through the subtle betrayals of the building itself. The mission floor had a way of sounding different in certain places. Some boards gave a hollow knock, others an almost muffled thud as though something dense pressed back against the wood from below. For weeks he thought little of it, until a violent summer storm rattled the swamp and drove water into the chapel through gaps in the old shutters. The priests moved quickly to protect the altar, but Marceau noticed their haste was not for the sacred objects above, it was for the floor beneath. They laid thick canvas across certain sections, weighting them down with candle stands and hymnals, their faces tight with quiet urgency. That night, when the storm had passed and the mission slept in its habitual post-Vespers silence, he returned alone with a lamp. The boards in the north transept yielded with little effort, nails sliding free as if they had been removed and replaced many times before. Beneath was a thin layer of packed soil, pale in the lamplight but threaded through with streaks of dull white dust. He brushed some aside and froze. The dust was not dust, it was powdered bone, the granules too coarse to be mistaken for anything else. As he scraped deeper, the shape beneath emerged, a narrow strip of human femur cut so precisely it seemed less taken from a body than machined for a purpose. Another followed and another until he saw the full pattern. The bones had been arranged not haphazardly but in an interlocking grid, each length fitted at perfect angles to the next, forming a lattice that spanned the entire space beneath the floor. The cuts were too clean for burial work, the joints too exact to be accidental. It was a design, deliberate and almost beautiful in its symmetry. Every piece bore markings, fine etchings that, when traced with his finger, formed repeating shapes, crosses, circles intersected by lines and symbols he did not recognize. The placement suggested an order that was neither random nor purely decorative. It was the sort of geometry seen in cathedral blueprints, where every line and angle was chosen for spiritual or acoustic effect. But here the material was not stone or glass, it was human bone. The air was thick with the faint chalky scent of calcium dust, a smell that seemed to cling to the back of the throat, refusing to fade. Marceau tried to imagine the labor involved. To build such a structure would require not just the remains of dozens, perhaps hundreds, but the precision of someone who had studied both anatomy and architecture. It was methodical in a way that made the killings themselves secondary. The deaths were only the first step, the raw material for something larger. He realized with a cold tightening in his chest that this was not a relic of the past. The lattice was clean, unrotted, and free of soil stains. It had been maintained. Replacing the boards, he sat in the darkened chapel, listening to the swamp beyond the walls. In the silence, he became aware of a faint vibration under his feet, as if the lattice itself hummed with some imperceptible frequency. The thought came to him unbidden. What if the swamp's unnatural quiet was not swallowing sound but feeding it into the bones below? And what prayer exactly was it building toward? He left before dawn, carrying the memory of that white geometry in his mind, certain that whatever purpose it served, it had not yet been fulfilled. What he did not know, what no one living had yet seen, was that there was a man in the mission who had dedicated his entire life to finishing the pattern, and he was already choosing the next bones to take. Brother Elias was the kind of man no one suspected. He moved through the mission with the quiet grace of a servant who had learned to be overlooked, his frame thin, his face soft and almost childlike despite the streaks of white in his hair. To the townsfolk, he was the caretaker, the one who mended robes, polished candlesticks, and tended the small vegetable garden behind the rectory. He spoke rarely, even before Vespers, but when he did, his voice carried a warmth that made people trust him instantly. Children liked him. The elderly leaned on his arm without hesitation. And yet, in the ledger Bishop Marceau had taken, Elias's name appeared in the margins beside nearly every entry marked complete. Marceau began watching him more closely. He noticed how Elias always volunteered to escort the sick to the infirmary, how he insisted on visiting parishioners in their homes when they failed to attend Mass, and how those same parishioners were sometimes never seen again. The absence of suspicion was his greatest shield. But it was Elias's private journal hidden beneath the false bottom of a chest in his quarters that revealed the truth. The pages smelled faintly of smoke and something sharper, something metallic. His handwriting was neat, almost tender in its precision, each word chosen with the same care one might use in arranging flowers. But the content was another matter entirely. He wrote of harvesting the light from the faithful, a process he claimed could only be achieved when the soul hovered between life and death, caught like a moth in the still air between heartbeats. He described isolating his chosen victims for days in total darkness, speaking to them in low, steady tones about salvation until their sense of time dissolved. He deprived them of food just long enough to weaken the body without dulling the mind, believing the soul's brilliance was most visible when tethered to a body trembling with hunger. When the moment came, he would lead them to a chamber deep beneath the chapel, a room he called the crucible. In the crucible, Elias would bind them upright in a narrow wooden frame, their arms fixed in an almost embracing posture. Around them, candles burned with wicks soaked in resin from the swamp's black pines, filling the air with a thick, sweet smoke that clung to the lungs. He believed the smoke softened the barrier between flesh and spirit, allowing what he called the light to seep outward. The killing itself was slow, controlled suffocation by a linen cloth drawn tightly over the mouth and nose, loosened at intervals to prolong the threshold state. He claimed the eyes revealed the moment the soul began to leave, the irises brightening like embers. At that instant, he would remove them with a small silver hook, placing each in a shallow dish of blessed oil to keep the gaze fixed toward heaven. The body, now empty, was merely raw material for the lattice, the bones prepared according to precise measurements. Elias wrote with the detachment of a craftsman perfecting his art. He recorded which conditions produced the most radiant light, youth combined with recent baptism, the terminally ill brought to health just enough to regain hope before the ritual, mothers separated from their children at the last moment. Each variation was an experiment, and every result fed into his growing understanding of what he called the Great Illumination, a final structure of bone and light that would sing in the language of God when completed. When Marceau finished reading, his hands were trembling. The pages felt warm, as if the ink had only just dried. Outside the swamp lay still, the water unbroken. Somewhere in the mission, Elias was moving quietly through his morning tasks, perhaps already thinking of the next person who would walk willingly into his care, unaware that in his mind they were already part of the design. The bishop could not yet see the lantern room above, but Elias could. Every step of the lattice climbing toward it, every skull a lantern, every soul a note in his silent hymn. The lantern room was not marked on any plan of the mission nor mentioned in any church record. Its existence was revealed only because Bishop Marceau, restless and unwilling to sleep, had followed the soundless path of Brother Elias one humid night. He watched the caretaker disappear up the narrow spiral stairs of the belfry, a place Marceau had assumed was long abandoned due to its warped beams and tilting frame. Yet the higher Elias climbed, the steadier his movements became, as if his body had rehearsed each step for decades. Marceau waited until the sound of the man's footfalls vanished, then began his own ascent, the lamp in his hand casting shapes along the stone that seemed to bow toward the center of the stairwell. At the top, the bishop found a short landing that ended at a door so flush with the wall it could vanish in shadow. It opened easily without lock or groan, as though it had been built not to keep people out but to invite them in at the right moment. Inside was a room no larger than a small chapel, but the air was thick and dry, the smell unlike anything in the mission below, a strange mix of resin, old smoke, and something faintly sweet, like flowers left too long in a vase. The light from his lamp fell on dozens of human skulls mounted on narrow wooden shelves that circled the walls. Each skull had been altered. A neat aperture had been carved into the crown, smooth as if polished by a jeweler's wheel, and inside traces of dark, hardened resin clung to the bone. Around some of the openings, faint burn marks stained the ivory surface, as though a flame had once been kindled within. Marceau leaned closer to one and saw that the interior glistened faintly, like oil on glass. Then he noticed something that made his breath catch. Some of the skulls very faintly emitted light. Not the steady flame of a candle, nor the erratic glow of embers, but a soft pulse, as if the bone itself was breathing. The shelves were arranged in deliberate sequence, the glowing ones spaced evenly among the dark, each facing inward toward the center of the room, where a low stone pedestal stood. Upon it rested a larger skull, its surface etched with the same symbols Marceau had seen on the bone lattice beneath the chapel. Its aperture was wider than the others, the edges reinforced with a thin band of beaten gold. He imagined the resin poured inside, the flame lit, the skull serving as a vessel that contained more than heat or light. Something Elias had extracted from the dying, something he believed still lived in the hollow spaces of bone. In the corner of the room sat a small wooden chest, its lid half open. Inside lay neat bundles of fabric, each containing small glass vials filled with a faintly luminous liquid. The bishop felt certain of what they held, Drops of the oil in which Elias preserved the victim's eyes, infused now with whatever essence he believed he had trapped. He understood then that the skulls were not memorials. They were instruments. Elias had not built the lantern room to honor the dead, but to harness them, arranging each so their combined light, however faint, formed part of some unfinished design. A faint sound reached him, a slow, deliberate step on the stair behind him. Elias emerged from the shadow, his face calm, his hands clasped loosely before him, as if welcoming the bishop to a holy place. There was no accusation in his eyes, only quiet certainty. In that moment, Marceau understood the depth of the man's conviction. This was not murder to Elias, it was worship. And the bishop knew with chilling certainty that the next time a lantern was added to this room, its light might be his own. Sister Aveline had lived in the infirmary for as long as most in Sacred Rock could remember. Her body frail and folded by age, her voice reduced to a rasp that barely carried across a room. She was a shadow in a white habit, drifting between her cot and the chapel like a ghost no one dared disturb. The priest tended to her needs with mechanical care, but Marceau noticed they never lingered at her bedside. Her meals were brought and taken away without a word. Her bandages changed in silence. She seemed in the way of the very old, half forgotten by the living. But when her skin grew yellow and her breathing shallow in the summer heat, she sent for the bishop with an urgency that startled the novices. She said she needed to make a final confession before nightfall, and that it could be spoken only to someone from outside the mission. Marceau found her propped against a mound of thin pillows, her hands trembling on the blanket. Her eyes, clouded by cataracts, fixed on him with a clarity her body no longer had. She began slowly, pausing often to gather breath, each word dragged up from some deep well of memory. She told him she had once served not as a nurse, but as an assistant to the priests, in preparation work. Her role, she said, had not been to heal, but to render the chosen vessels ready for their place in the lattice. She spoke of rooms deep beneath the chapel where the air was heavy with steam from great copper vats, where bodies were lowered whole into boiling water until the flesh slipped free from the bone in pale ribbons. The smell, she said, never truly left her skin. Once stripped, the bones were sorted by size and strength. Femurs and humeri were measured with calipers, spines laid out in long, curved rows like ivory serpents. The skulls were treated differently. Elias would sit beside her at a long table, the chosen skull resting on a cloth, and he would open the crown with the care of a surgeon, his hands steady, his breath slow. Aveline's task was to drain the marrow from the long bones into crystal ampules, the liquid still warm, swirling thick and golden in the lamplight. This marrow, she was told, was the blood of the structure, to be kept sealed and hidden until the lattice was ready to be made whole. She had never understood the full meaning, but she had seen the way Elias handled those ampules, holding them to his chest like relics. Worst of all, she said, were the eyes. The victims were never killed before this part. Elias insisted the removal happen while the person still breathed, claiming the gaze in those final moments was a direct prayer to God, and that to preserve it was to preserve their holiness forever. Aveline had been made to hold their heads steady, her fingers pressing against temples slick with sweat, while Elias extracted the eyes with that small silver hook. Some fought, Some screamed until their voices broke, but many were too weak to resist, their breaths already shallow from days of deprivation. She remembered one young girl, no more than 12, whose eyes remained open even after removal, the gaze fixed on Aveline as if asking why. That face still haunted her dreams. The sister's voice faltered, and for a moment Marceau thought she would drift into sleep. But she gripped his wrist with surprising strength. She told him that Elias had not been working alone all these years. Others in the mission had taken their turn at the crucible, guided by his method. The lattice was not the work of a single lifetime, but of generations, each adding to it as part of a silent vow. She had kept her part out of fear, but also because the silence after Vespers was not simply a rule. It was a shield. She believed that speaking at night would let the dead hear and follow the voice back into the world. Her grip loosened, and she fell back onto the pillows, her breathing shallow and uneven. Marceau felt the weight of her confession pressing on him, thick as the swamp air outside. If what she said was true, the mission was not a place of faith at all. It was a machine, built and maintained for a single terrible purpose. And now, with the lattice nearly complete, Elias's design might be reaching its final stage. Somewhere above them in the lantern room, the soft, unnatural light might already be growing stronger. The first time Bishop Marceau heard the swamp choir, it was not at night, but in the muted half-light of dawn, when the air still clung to the cool of darkness. He had risen early to escape the closeness of his quarters, stepping into the courtyard where the fog lay in low bands across the ground. The chapel bell had not yet rung for morning prayers, and the mission was still wrapped in its imposed silence. That was when it came, faint at first, like a whisper carried over water. It was not one voice, but many, layered in a strange harmony that rose and fell without melody or rhythm. Some voices were high and strained, others low and guttural, yet all seemed to draw from the same breath, as though the swamp itself were exhaling through them. Marceau followed the sound to the water's edge. The black surface was smooth, yet he could see slow ripples spreading outward from nowhere, the reeds trembling without wind. The voices were clearer here, and he began to distinguish words, not in Latin nor in any language he recognized, but in a cadence that felt purposeful. They wove together in tones that carried both pleading and accusation. His skin prickled, not from fear of the unknown, but from the awful suspicion that these were not the voices of the living. Later, after Mass, he asked one of the novices about it in a casual tone. The boy's face blanched, and he quickly crossed himself, muttering something about the submersion rites before fleeing down the cloister walk. Marceau understood enough of the phrase to know it was not metaphor. That night he hid himself in the tall grass at the edge of the swamp, waiting. The heat drew insects in a constant whining cloud, but he did not move. After Vespers, as darkness thickened, Elias appeared on the path, pushing a small, flat-bottomed boat before him. 2 other priests followed, carrying between them a limp figure bound at the wrists and ankles, the head covered with a black cloth. They moved with unhurried care, lowering the figure into the boat and pushing out toward the deeper channel. There, Elias and the others stood over their captive, chanting low and steady. At a signal, they lifted the body and fitted it into a weighted frame, a wooden harness with chains that sank deep into the water. Marceau watched as the bound form was lowered slowly, the chains rattling until the black surface swallowed it whole. Bubbles broke the stillness, and then the water was silent again, until the voices began. It started as a single tone, low and almost human, but it swelled quickly as if joined by others rising from beneath. The sound grew denser, filling the night with a strange, underwater resonance that seemed to vibrate through the air and into Marceau's bones. He realized with horror that each submersion added a new voice to the choir, the sound growing richer with every life taken. The priest stood motionless, listening as though receiving instruction. When the chanting ceased, Elias knelt to collect something from the water. A small glass sphere no larger than a child's fist, glistening in the lamplight. Inside it, Marceau saw the faint shimmer of moving air, a last breath caught and sealed. Elias held it up with reverence before tucking it into his robes. The boat turned back toward shore, the water behind them still trembling with unseen movement. Marceau stayed hidden until the voices faded, replaced once more by the swamp's unnatural silence. He returned to his quarters with the certainty that the choir was no legend or superstition. It was real, and it was growing, each note a life cut short, each chord another thread woven into Elias's design. Somewhere beneath that black water, an entire congregation was waiting, singing not to be saved but to be used. And if the pattern was as precise as the ledger suggested, the swamp choir was not yet complete. The deeper Bishop Marceau studied the ledger, the more it began to feel like the mission itself was nothing more than the surface skin of something vast and hidden beneath. The earlier pages had shown dates, names, and terse remarks about completion. But toward the end, Father Mallory's notes shifted into something stranger: mathematics. The margins were thick with numbers that seemed at first to be simple records of time and weight, but when Marceau laid tracing paper over several pages and connected certain figures, they formed repeating patterns. Spirals intersecting lines and grids reminiscent of the bone lattice under the chapel. Every entry followed a structure: victim's name, exact age, height, body weight to the ounce, and then the lunar phase at the time of death. There were temperature readings, moisture percentages, even calculations of atmospheric pressure. Mallory seemed obsessed with the relationship between the body's condition and the alignment of celestial cycles. One set of columns, underlined in red ink, was labeled Purity Yield, with numbers that rose and fell according to the victim's physical state and the date of the rite. The word yield was used again and again, as if this were not about people at all, but a harvest. Marceau realized that these were not idle notes. They were the refinement of a method decades in the making. Victims were chosen to meet exact conditions: a certain ratio of muscle to fat, an age bracket that avoided both the softness of youth and the brittleness of old age, specific birth months that aligned with desired moon phases. Even the time between baptism and death was recorded, as if spiritual freshness were another measurable quantity. This was not ritual in the chaotic, frenzied sense of pagan sacrifice. It was controlled, clinical, and repeated with the precision of an experiment. Among the pages was a set of diagrams showing the lattice beneath, the chapel as it might appear once complete. Each bone had a placement code. The femur of a man of 32, baptized within the last 5 years, would occupy a different position in the grid than the spine of a woman of 50 who had fasted before death. Mallory's handwriting on one page was particularly fevered. Resonance increases with density balance. Perfected structure will hold prayer indefinitely. The idea chilled Marceau. This was a structure meant not for worshippers, but for the dead themselves. A permanent chorus, their remains arranged to transmit something endlessly, without decay or interruption. Worse still were the notes that hinted at what might happen when the design was finished. Mallory speculated that once the lattice reached its final alignment, the illumination would no longer be confined to the lantern room or the swamp. The very air of Sacred Rock would carry it. The silence after Vespers would be unnecessary because the work would be self-sustaining, drawing on the constant hum of its own completed form. It would, as one line read in unnervingly plain script, sing forever whether God hears it or not. Marceau closed the ledger and felt a kind of sickness spread through him. Not just from the horror of the killings, but from the recognition of the mind behind them. This was not madness in the sense of chaos, it was obsession harnessed to discipline. It was a faith that had stripped away morality until only the mechanics of devotion remained. He understood now that every death was not only a step in the lattice's construction, but also a data point in an equation spanning decades. And somewhere in the mission, Elias had inherited these calculations like a sacred trust, perhaps even improved upon them. The swamp lay silent outside his window, but in his mind Marceau could hear the hum of the lattice beneath the chapel and the distant pulsing glow of the lantern room above. It was a rhythm now, a metronome counting down, not to an end, but to a completion. The choir was not the final design. It was only the overture. In the long history of Sacred Rock, there was one night the priests dared to miss Vespers, and it became the only story the older clergy would not speak of even under the seal of confession. It was the summer of 1884, the air thick and restless with storms, when a fever swept through the mission and half the brothers lay too weak to stand. The bells did not ring that evening. The candles were not lit, the prayers were not spoken. For the first time in living memory, the night fell on the mission without the barrier of its ritual silence. The change was immediate. As the last streaks of daylight bled into the swamp, the air grew unnaturally heavy, pressing down on the lungs until each breath felt stolen. From the black water came not the usual faint whisper of the swamp choir, but a roar of voices so loud and close it seemed they were inside the walls. They were not singing. They were calling in tones that cracked and bled, as if the water itself had been torn open. The sound wormed its way through the timbers of the chapel, vibrating in the bones of those who lay in their sick beds. By midnight, the priests who could still walk began to move through the halls with lanterns, searching for the source. But there was no single point from which the noise came. It was everywhere, spilling down the stairwells, seeping in through the floorboards. Then came the screams. Not from outside, but from within. 3 priests were found dead in their beds, their mouths sewn shut with coarse black thread that had been knotted not from the outside, but from within their own throats. There was no sign of struggle, no marks of restraint, and yet the expression in their clouded eyes suggested they had died in terror. The survivors gathered in the chapel, clutching crucifixes and murmuring fractured prayers into the din. But the voices only grew louder, layering into something that was no longer entirely human. Objects began to shift on their own, the altar cloth trembling, the lantern flames bending toward the floor as though drawn downward. From beneath the boards came a steady knocking, slow and deliberate, as if something below were testing the strength of the wood. The bone lattice, though unseen, seemed to thrum in answer to the chorus outside. It was Brother Elias who finally moved to restore the silence. With no ceremony, he struck the chapel bell 13 times in rapid succession, the clang shattering through the roar. Then he gave a signal to the few who could still stand, and they began the Vespers prayers in unison, voices low and trembling. One by one the words were spoken, each syllable tightening around the sound outside like a rope pulling closed. By the time the final amen left their lips, the swamp was still again. The air lightened, the knocking stopped. In the days that followed, the 3 dead priests were buried without rites, their graves unmarked, their names struck from the mission's rolls. No one dared question why, but it was understood. The silence after Vespers would never again be broken. From that night onward, even the sick were carried to the chapel, their prayers forced from fevered lips before dusk. And though no one admitted it aloud, a shared fear lingered in the hearts of all who survived, that whatever had been held at bay by their ritual had not been banished, only waiting, listening for the smallest lapse to come again. Bishop Marceau, hearing the story in fragments from a trembling novice, understood what it meant. The silence was not merely a precaution, it was a lock. And if the lattice and the choir were the key, Elias had been guarding something far worse than the sum of their parts. Something that had been ready to enter the world the moment the barrier failed. The hurricane of 1887 came in from the Gulf with a force that seemed almost personal. A grinding wall of wind and water that tore roofs from their beams and sent whole trees into the swamp like splintered arrows. Sacred Rock was not built to withstand such anger. And before the night was over, the chapel roof was partially gone, its bell tower cracked, and half the north wall caved in. The next morning, as the surviving priests moved through the wreckage in the choking humidity, they found that the storm had not only damaged the building, it had revealed something it was never meant to. Where the north wall had collapsed, the floor had splintered open, exposing the mouth of a narrow tunnel running beneath the chapel. The entrance was slick with swamp mud, the air rising from it heavy and stale, carrying a smell that was neither entirely rot nor entirely earth. Elias was the first to descend, a lantern in his hand, his steps slow but without hesitation. Marceau followed at a distance, each footfall bringing the sick certainty that they were walking into the true heart of the mission. The tunnel widened into a long chamber carved from the clay and reinforced with wooden beams blackened by age. On either side, human skeletons knelt in perfect rows, their spines curved forward, their hands clasped in eternal prayer. Their jaws were locked open, and as Marceau drew closer, he saw why. Each jaw was held in place by a thin, rusted metal brace, keeping the mouth frozen as though mid-chant. The skulls faced the center aisle, creating the feeling of a congregation that had been buried alive and left to worship forever. It was not just the posture that turned Marceau's stomach. It was what lay inside the skulls. Each one contained a thin, rolled strip of gold, etched with biblical verses so finely that the letters were barely visible without leaning close. The strips had been curled and pressed into the hollow of the cranium, the metal catching the lantern light with an almost living shimmer. Elias stopped to adjust one, his fingers lingering as though ensuring the fit was perfect. The chamber stretched far beyond the limits of the chapel above, the air growing colder with each step. At intervals, the floor was interrupted by shallow stone basins, their rims stained a deep reddish brown. In one, Marceau saw the faint outline of a handprint, as if someone had pressed a blood-soaked palm there and it had been left to dry into the stone itself. The basins were aligned with the kneeling skeletons, suggesting a ritual that had been repeated here countless times. The scale of it was staggering. Dozens upon dozens of bodies, their bones arranged with the same meticulous precision as the lattice above. These were not the forgotten dead of the swamp. These were chosen, prepared, and placed. The verses in gold hinted at a purpose beyond the physical. The chamber was not a tomb, but a kind of machine, one that required both the structure of bone and the word of Scripture to operate. Marceau realized with a wave of nausea that the skeletons might have been added over decades, each one another cog in the design, each verse another note in a hymn only Elias could hear in full. As the hurricane's afterwinds moaned through the broken chapel above, Elias turned and met Marceau's gaze, his face calm, his eyes lit with the reflection of his lantern. He gestured slowly, almost reverently, to the endless rows, and in that moment the bishop understood that this was not a place of mourning. It was a congregation in waiting, arranged not for God's presence but for something else, something that would come only when the last place in the procession was filled. And from the way Elias's gaze lingered on him, Marceau knew he had just been measured for where he might stand. Bishop Renaud arrived at Sacred Rock in the autumn of 1889, sent by higher authorities to investigate troubling whispers that had reached the diocese. Unlike Marceau, he came not as an observer but as an enforcer, a man with a reputation for dismantling corruption with ruthless efficiency. He moved through the mission with sharp eyes and little patience, questioning the priests, inspecting the chapel, and announcing within days that the place would be dissolved. The brothers were to be reassigned, the buildings dismantled, the land left to the swamp. His decisiveness seemed almost reckless in a place so steeped in hidden rules. On his fourth night, Renaud refused the silence after Vespers. He lingered in the chapel, speaking openly to a novice who tried to shush him, his voice carrying in the heavy air. Those nearby said the swamp seemed to stir at the sound, faint ripples breaking the still surface under a starless sky. By morning, the bishop was gone. His horse had been found wandering near the tree line, saddle still in place, reins dragging in the mud. 2 days later, Renaud's body was discovered in the locked chapel. He was laid out on the altar as if for burial, but something was wrong. His body was entirely hollowed out. The skin remained intact, draped loosely over the altar's edge like a discarded vestment. But the weight of him was gone. His limbs folded unnaturally light, his chest caved in around a space where ribs had been carefully severed and removed. Inside that hollow, pressed flat against the cavity, was an open Bible, its pages splayed like wings. The verses it revealed spoke of sacrifice, obedience, and the silence of the faithful before God. No blood stained the altar or the floor. There were no signs of struggle, no marks on his skin. It was as if the contents of his body had been drawn out without violence, leaving behind only the shell and the scripture. The priests stood around him in stillness, their faces blank, and when Marceau demanded to know who had done this, no one spoke. Elias, standing at the rear, merely watched, his hands clasped loosely before him. The next evening, Vespers were spoken with more force than Marceau had ever heard. The final Amen echoing against the chapel walls as though sealing the building shut. The message was clear. The mission would not be dismantled, not while the lattice was unfinished, not while the design still required voices to fill its final places. In the summer of 1890, the silence of Sacred Rock was broken not by defiance, but by law. A team of federal marshals arrived under orders to investigate the disappearance of Bishop Renaud and several missing parishioners whose families had pressed the diocese for answers. Their arrival was met with the same blank stillness that had always shielded the mission. No one greeted them, no questions were answered, and after Vespers the priests simply vanished into their dormitories as though the marshals were ghosts. But the marshals came with warrants, and they did not intend to be ignored. On the second day they forced open the locked archive room in the rectory and found architectural sketches hidden beneath hymnals. Drawings that showed the chapel floor not as a flat surface but as a cover, concealing an intricate pattern beneath. The lines and symbols matched nothing in known church design. That evening, without the priest's consent, the marshals brought crowbars and lanterns into the chapel and began prying up the boards. Elias was not among the priests who tried to stop them. He had simply vanished, though no one could say where. The first boards gave way to a thin layer of packed earth, easily dug aside. Beneath it lay the lattice in full, a vast, deliberate arrangement of human bones shaped into the outline of a great cathedral when viewed from above. Femurs formed the soaring columns. Ribs curved into arches, vertebrae arranged into delicate tracery like the stonework of a rose window. The bones were clean, free of rot, and many were inscribed with initials so small they could only be read by holding them inches from the eye. Some bore dates alongside the names, the most recent only months old. The structure was so exact, so impossibly balanced, that the marshals hesitated before disturbing it. Then, with a single careless pull, one man dislodged a femur from the outer frame. What followed was not the collapse of a pile, but the unraveling of something alive. The lattice seemed to sigh, a faint exhalation of powder drifting upward as the bones gave way all at once. They did not fall in clattering ruin. They crumbled into fine white dust, collapsing inward as though they had been waiting for release. The dust hung in the lamplight, swirling in patterns that for a moment seemed to take shape. The faint outlines of faces' mouths open in silent chant, before scattering into the air. When it was over, the marshals stood ankle-deep in the pale remains, the intricate design erased in seconds. The chapel floor was nothing now but an open pit of emptiness. Outside, the swamp stirred. Some swore they heard the choir rise faintly, then fade into a single long note that thinned until it was gone. By dawn, the marshals had sealed the chapel and ordered the priests taken into custody. But Elias was never found. In the days that followed, a thin layer of white residue settled over the entire mission, clinging to window sills and creeping into the grain of the wood. No matter how much the marshals scrubbed, it returned each morning as if the design had not been destroyed at all, but simply dispersed, waiting for someone to begin arranging it again. When the mission finally burned, it went up in silence. No cries, no shouts, no ringing of the chapel bell. Only the deep crack of timbers surrendering to flame and the hiss of the swamp as wind carried embers into the black water. The marshals had ordered the destruction after the last of the priests were taken away, citing the danger of the structure and the sickness of its history. But those who watched from the safety of the tree line swore they saw the fire behave strangely, curling low along the ground before climbing the walls as if tracing a remembered pattern. The flames seemed to linger longest where the lattice had been, turning the dust of bone into drifting sparks that rose and vanished into the dark. In the months that followed, the diocese moved quickly to erase the name of Sacred Rock from its records. Families of the missing were given quiet settlements. New burial laws were passed, requiring inspection of all church crypts and ossuaries by secular officials before consecration. The rules were written in language that made no mention of the mission, yet the timing left no doubt as to their cause. Still, the marshal's reports remained sealed, marked for the eyes of senior clergy only. Whatever they had seen in the lattice and the choir was deemed unfit for public telling. For Bishop Marceau, the silence was not relief but burden. He carried Sister Aveline's confession in memory, the hum of the bone lattice under his feet, the faint glow of the lantern room in his eyes. He knew that Elias was still alive. The man's work had been too precise, his disappearance too clean. Without the lattice to anchor it, the design had been scattered into the air, into the water, into the soil. And Elias, patient as the swamp itself, would be searching for the pieces. The locals who had lived their whole lives in the mission's shadow felt the absence in ways they could not name. At dusk, they said the swamp's stillness had changed, not quieter but expectant. Sometimes on windless nights, a single human note could be heard from the water, low and steady, as if someone were holding the first tone of a hymn, waiting for the rest to join. Evil does not always die when its vessel is broken. Sometimes it disperses, finding places to settle until the right hands call it back together. Sacred Rock was gone, but the silence after Vespers, the lock that had held something at bay, was broken forever. And now the question hung in the air like the dust that had once formed the lattice. If someone began to speak the right words in the right place, would it all return? Could it happen again?